Welcome to the Inbetween Podcast. Today I am joined by Allison Kirvan, founder of Nightingale Wellness Therapy and licensed marriage and family therapist, trained in EMDR, ACT, attachment theory, DBT, and intuitive eating. Allison is passionate about helping clients navigate the complexities of their relationships, helping them to reclaim their personal power and cultivate healthier patterns of coping after trauma. Allison, welcome to the Inbetween Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to chat all things really mental health and mental wellness and get into that conversation. But I would love for you to start by introducing yourself to my audience and how you became passionate about these things.
So my name is Allison Kirvan. I've always been passionate about mental health. Growing up, I kind of wished I had more resources for it. And so once I started seeing clients, I was noticing that there was just a lot of people that were experiencing that complex trauma, but that they didn't really have a word for it. Felt like it wasn't real or as bad as other people's things. So that's how I decided to start getting trained in EMDR. And so that's mostly what I use in my practice.
That's awesome. And was there a moment within that journey where you were like, this is what I'm meant to do?
Yeah, I think when maybe like my first month of seeing clients. My first week, I was so nervous, I couldn't really tell. But then after that, once I started making the connection with clients and things like that, I knew it's like what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to hear more from an expert about trauma and then about PTSD. Does PTSD happen to everyone that experienced trauma? And do we all experience trauma, or is that something that, there's a sliding scale?
So not everybody that experiences, like two people can experience the same event. I think in The Body Keeps the Score, there's an example of a couple that gets into a car accident and they kind of see the car in front of them, like the people dying. And so one of them did develop PTSD, but the other didn't. So it just all depends on how you cope with it afterwards, if you feel like you have the support to cope. So not everybody develops it. And then what was your other question?
No, you're good. How do you define trauma? I mean, I know that there's different forms of it, and there's obviously, like you just mentioned, a car accident, but I also imagine it can be, trauma inducing to have parents that go through a divorce. So what exactly is trauma?
So trauma is usually defined as anything that overwhelms your ability to cope with it. And so usually it is the development of a specific belief that starts to get into other areas of your life. So for example, if you have the car accident, then anything related to a car or driving, or if there was something like on your neck, even something touching your neck, those can all be the symptoms later on. So then it just starts to kind of branch out in your brain and overgeneralize certain situations. So you might start to have a trauma response even if you're in a safe situation, just because it is similar to what happened when the trauma occurred. And so that's PTSD. And then complex PTSD is more if it happens over a prolonged period of time. So if you have a parent who went to prison or something like that, then you might have that belief of I'm abandoned, and it might not just have happened once, but multiple times. So you're a little bit more hypervigilant and more looking for that in your life.
Interesting. So is there a cure for the after effects of trauma? So let's say PTSD, once you're diagnosed with that, do you have it forever?
People can do therapy and work through it so that they no longer have that PTSD diagnoses. And that can be a combination of EMDR to kind of reshape how that memory is stored in your brain, so it no longer feels like it's still happening to you when you think about it. And then with complex PTSD, it's a little bit more things are impacted by complex PTSD, like your self-confidence, your relationship with other people, your ability to trust, how you take care of yourself. And so a lot of those things, usually you can build the skills to learn how to do those things differently. And then a combination of EMDR to kind of reprocess the trauma can reduce a lot of those symptoms.
Okay. So I just want to clarify for myself. So PTSD is more of one incident, whereas complex PTSD may be multiple instances over a period of time.
Yeah, they call it like big T trauma and little T trauma. So big T
Ah, yes, I've
trauma
heard that.
is usually PTSD, like big events happened. And then little T trauma is usually things that somebody might be like, that's not that big of a deal. But if it happens to you again and again, it impacts like how you see yourself and the world and other people.
Hmm. And this can happen, I mean, you can experience either of these at any time in your life, right? It's not just in childhood or just under 18. It can be any time.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. And what are the modalities that you utilize in your practice when you're dealing with someone with either PTSD or complex PTSD?
Usually EMDR, sometimes for people, if kind of talking about the trauma is already really overwhelming, then we'll start more with regulating their nervous system, like having tools outside of session. I use a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is kind of being aware of what's going on internally. So, like, when this person does this, I notice I have this body sensation and this emotion, and this thought keeps running through my head. So you're kind of getting to know your trauma responses. And then we identify ways that are helpful to respond to that trauma that is still living your values. Because a lot of times we'll respond in a way that can kind of just put us in a cycle. I feel like I
Hmm.
can't trust you, so I'm going to isolate, but then I feel alone.
Mm.
And then it just like kind of cycles.
So the acceptance and commitment therapy,
Mhm.
does that help you help bring self-awareness to that person to then create different patterns?
Yeah, it helps
Okay.
them start to understand where did this come from that I'm experiencing, like this anxiety? What are kind of like the roots of it? And what is it like
Yeah.
specifically for me when I experience it? And then how do I want to respond instead of react when that thing happens?
Mm. That's so powerful. I feel like even if you haven't experienced maybe big T, little t trauma just in everyday life, I feel like that could be a useful tool.
Yes, definitely. We can definitely be very reactive when we're stressed. So it's good to know like our buttons and how we want to respond when they come up.
Yeah. Are there any within that practice, specifically the ACT, are there any tools that you could give our audience if they're just wanting to notice and react differently to certain situations?
A big one, especially when I've been doing with clients recently, is identifying your values because usually you want to know your top 10 values and those can change over time. I usually do mine like once a year because then that is going to help guide you of like how you want to respond. So for example, like if your value is connection with other people and you're noticing that you're having this anxiety come up, then you're going to respond to that differently than if your value is solitude. You know, like you want to know what's important to you so that you can kind of guide that response based on what matters to you. And then with the mindfulness, one that a lot of clients like is it's called like leaves on a stream. Because especially with like complex PTSD, we'll have a thought come up, I'm not good enough. And then we'll ruminate about it and think about all the times we were not good enough. So the leaves on the stream is a visualization where you just try to picture you're watching all of your thoughts pass like leaves on a stream and you're just watching it. Like you're not going up and picking up the leaves or believing all of the thoughts. You're just like noticing them come and go.
I love that visualization. That is so powerful. I literally, as you were talking, was thinking about something that happened yesterday, and I was doing that exact thing, and I had to separate myself. One thing happened, and it triggered just this chain effect of thoughts of like all these other moments in my life where this one feeling came up. And it's definitely hard to remove yourself from the stream because I was sitting on a leaf following all of them rather than just noticing it.
Yeah, and then when you notice you're like in the stream with them, you're just like, oh, I'm so glad I noticed. I'm in the
Yep.
stream. Let me come back to the side of the stream. And you just keep going.
Yeah, I love that. And that's something that people can implement today as well. And so, how could you explain to us what EMDR is, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and how you use it for trauma and PTSD?
Yes. So usually, when you experience a trauma, your brain stores the worst part of it and then develops like a belief to cope with it. Like that thing happened to me because I wasn't good enough. And so, if I just am enough, in the future, this won't ever happen to me again. Like it's a faulty sense of kind of control. And so EMDR, we go back and identify what the memory is, what the belief was, the body sensations, and the emotions. And then we do something called bilateral stimulation, which you'll use like moving your eyes back and forth or doing tapping. And that just reminds your brain that like you are here in this moment and you're safe as you think about the past memory, because without that, you kind of feel like your whole body is transported back to that thing and you're reliving it. So it just allows your like thinking brain to be there as you think about the memory so that you can integrate new information. A lot of times people will be like, oh, I'm realizing that like I was 4 when that happened and now I'm 30. If that happened to me again, it wouldn't happen in that same way because I'm not that little girl anymore. So that's kind of how it works. So then at the end of processing, a new belief will come up. If it was, I'm not good enough, then the new belief will be like, I am enough, or I can get my needs met. And your units of distress, we scale that at the beginning. If it starts at a 9, the goal is to get it down between a 0 and a 2. So your distress will go down, the body sensations will be calm, and then you'll have a new belief about yourself.
That's incredible. And is that normally done in one session, or do you feel that you have to do multiple?
It depends. For some people, if cognitively, because sometimes people cognitively will understand, like, I was a kid, I know that wasn't my fault, but you just still have the feeling like, but I feel like it kind of was. So if people are in that space, it's usually pretty quick, like one 50-minute session. Other people, if it's still like they fully cognitively think it was their fault and believe it, it can take longer. I've had some people where it's like up to 5 or 6 sessions just because that belief has been really reinforced for a long time.
Yeah, that's what I assumed you were going to say, because I've done EMDR and there's been certain, specific traumas where we do one session and I feel really good, but there was one belief that I had that just stuck and I just had to keep coming back and keep having the sessions. And then eventually it definitely, what I would describe as felt less. Like I noticed a lot of the belief was attached to my business as an entrepreneur. And so it was something that was constantly being reinforced, like you said, as I went to work every single day. And so of course it would be harder than maybe a big trauma that happened once.
Yes, definitely. Especially, yeah, if you're still in an environment where that thing is triggered a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely very useful. I would say that I didn't, given obviously how you described it is exactly what happens. You're with your therapist, you're in a safe place, and you're tapping, making that eye movement, and you don't expect it to be so exhausting. Like I left my first session, I was like, I can't work today. It's definitely a lot of work internally, both obviously on your brain, but I would feel like on your soul and just the dialogue that's going on internally. Do you find that that is how patients feel often?
Yes, I usually tell clients before we start, it is pretty draining because, yeah, it's like emotionally draining to go there and be thinking about that. But then your brain is literally rewiring through that process. So it's a lot. And if the body sensations come up, your body can be very tired too.
Yeah. So I know we've kind of touched on obviously the trauma stuff, but who exactly is a good candidate for EMDR? Because obviously the belief stuff, and I asked you this question because I had gone and done EMDR specifically for my brother who had passed away. It was a big T trauma, right? And so it was triggering and there were things going on that I needed to address. But eventually within therapy, I had a really tough conversation in a work environment that I realized in starting my business was affecting how I showed up to the business. And that conversation, we actually did EMDR around. And when my therapist first approached it and said we should do EMDR about this, I was like, wait, what? That doesn't make sense. It wasn't something that, of course, was a trauma in the way that a passing of a sibling had been. And so who is a candidate? What kind of situations do you see and treat that people find relief?
So for most clients, like when they are describing a situation situation or something that was distressing, I kind of tried to identify if there is a negative core belief there. And if there is, so I think that's a big thing. If there are negative core beliefs that are coming up often, and then also just making sure that they're in a place where they have enough support and stability to start doing the EMDR work, because especially with complex trauma, once you process one thing, that can kind of bring up another that was under the surface, and so can leave you very emotionally raw and all of those things. And so just making sure that they have the coping skills, social support, things like that outside of session in place. And then, yeah, I think any situation where a negative core belief is coming up, even things that are like small, like your partner being on the phone when you're talking to them, you could do EMDR on that. Any place you're noticing it's coming up.
Okay, that's interesting. So really anything that's like causes a negative belief. And is there a way, maybe someone who's listening who maybe hasn't been to therapy yet, that they could identify if something has a negative belief attached to it?
Yeah, so sometimes just looking at what your negative self-talk is. So like when you're stressed, how do you talk to yourself? And if it's thoughts like, I'm stupid or things like that, you can just ask, well, what does that mean about me? If I'm stupid, does that mean I'm a bad person or I'm not good enough or I'm unlovable or I'm worthless or something like that? And those are the negative core beliefs. So you're just seeing, what does that thing mean about me? Do I have the acceptance with it, or do I feel like it means this big thing?
The patterns of those thoughts. That's kind of a great segue into something I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like therapy is obviously very trendy right now with social media and everyone just having these conversations on Instagram, TikTok, all of those things. And I do think I see a lot coming up is how women specifically, how we talk to ourselves. And how does how we talk to ourselves daily, the things that we say, the thoughts in our head, one, how does that actually impact us? Does it have a huge impact on our mental well-being? And then the second half of that question, are we able to change it? Is it something that we're going to have to practice every day, or is it something that we're going to wake up and now I talk positively to myself?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the way that you talk to yourself really impacts your day to day. Like, even just thinking about going on a date, if you go into the date believing I'm worthless, you probably are going to be on a different date than if you believed you were worthy first. And then also just like how you carry yourself through that date, how you talk about yourself and what you want. If you believe you're worthless, you might settle for whatever it is that they're offering, things like that. It really impacts the opportunities, then your self-care, how you take care of yourself and your hygiene and all of those things. And then it is definitely something that we can change. Obviously, EMDR is a big one for that, but then also just self-compassion, even inner child work. And kind of, if you have that thought, I'm so lazy or something like that, trying to trace it back. Like, when did I first start believing that I was lazy? And was that something I came up with, or was that something like my dad said to me every day he came home and I was sitting down, or something like that? And then you can have the self-compassion of, it makes sense that I believe that I'm lazy because I'm sitting down because that's what I grew up with. But is that true for me now? Do I believe sitting down is lazy, or is that relaxation or something different? So the awareness, I think, is the biggest part, which can be very hard. I think it's hard to say to ourselves, like, oh, I feel unlovable right now. But like having the awareness and then the kindness, the self-kindness can help shift that.
Yeah, it is very difficult because you have the awareness, and then honestly, sometimes to choose the alternative of whatever you're saying, it feels more comfortable to just stay in that pain, even though you know it's causing you pain. It's just more comfortable there.
Yeah. And because sometimes in the beginning, like the opposite, because it feels so untrue, it's not as helpful. So sometimes picking something neutral can be better. Like, I am learning to believe that I'm good enough, or I am starting to do things to get my needs met, and things like that. So finding something that still feels true, but isn't like I'm a horrible person or something.
Yeah, it's like skipping through the extremes of it and finding something in the middle. Are there any practices specifically, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's an activity of looking at yourself in the mirror, that you encourage clients to do when they're struggling with that self-talk?
Yes, I really the stream of consciousness journaling, just so that you can see like what the associations are in your brain and all of that. And then I like the exercise of getting a picture of yourself from when you're younger and putting it as the background on your phone or on your bathroom mirror or something. And so when you're starting to have that negative self-talk, kind of looking at the picture and say, would I say this to her? I think those are two of my favorite ones. And then yeah, just the mindfulness of taking a step back from it and saying, instead of I'm a piece of shit, kind of like I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I'm a piece of shit right now, so that you're not believing it or acting on it. You're just noticing that, oh, when I make a mistake, that is the first thought that comes up for me.
Yeah, I love both of those activities. I think the one of the picture must be extremely powerful to, I mean, I just think when you were talking about that, I thought about my 2-year-old nephew, and I'm like, okay, I would never say anything like that to him, but
Yeah.
it must be even more powerful to look at a picture of yourself younger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that one.
That's huge. How do other people's words come into play with this? Because as you were speaking, I was thinking about having conversations with friends and family, or maybe you get into an argument and maybe they say something like, "You made me feel X, Y, and Z." And how do you separate yourself, still take ownership, but also not receive that in a way that now you're telling yourself that's your fault, and kind of the guilt and shame there?
Yeah. Well, I think like how people communicate those things is important. If they are framing it that way of, like it's your fault I feel this way, then that's something that is a focus in sessions as well, because there can be a lot of like people pleasing and enmeshed boundaries. So we kind of go over like specific language they might be used to from other people, and if there's like any red flags or unhelpful things there and how they can respond. So making sure that you're focusing on a behavior, right? They didn't like how I did the dishes, so I can take accountability for that. Or some people present it as you're so lazy or you're so selfish. So then I always recommend people ask for them to reword that. Like, okay, it sounds like
Mhm.
you're more attacking my character. Can you tell me what the behavior is that you'd like me to change? And then, if that they can't do that, then just assessing some of your relationships and noticing if you're in a lot of relationships where they do make you feel like everything is your fault and they're like attacking your character often.
Yeah, relationships are hard, no matter if it's husband and wife, father, son, no matter what type of relationship, it can be very hard because I think, especially when you start to do the work and take responsibility, it can be very eye opening to those who are not doing the same.
Yes. Yeah, it can be lonely, and it definitely that's something I try to like prepare clients for, but it's difficult of once you start doing the work, especially EMDR, like how you carry yourself and see yourself is so different that a lot of the things that fit before just don't fit. So it can bring changes in your life for sure.
Yeah, and navigating those changes and ensuring that you're putting yourself in a safe space, even if that means stepping back from those specific relationships that maybe aren't aligning anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I read on your Instagram specifically that I actually put in quotation marks for a quote for you is to stop feeling guilty for setting boundaries and to start healing. And I just love that. And I would love to hear more from you about what that means to you and your practice.
Yes. So a lot of clients that I work with grew up as like the black sheep in their family. And especially if you grew up parentified with your parent, it's like a role reversal and you feel like you're in charge of their well-being. And so even a
Mm.
small boundary of I'm too tired to go do that right now or something feels like you're a bad daughter or a bad person and things like that. So yeah, it's just so much guilt for taking up space or for having your own opinions or thoughts or emotions about different things. So, yeah, so that let go of the guilt.
And yeah, and start the healing. And how do you, can you reverse guilt? Can you see it differently, or are you stuck there?
Well, a reframe that I use often with clients is to see it more as empathy, right? Like,
Mm,
I feel for this person's situation and I feel for them that they have behaved in a way that has made people distance from them. And also, that is not my responsibility. So, yeah, so I try to reframe it of like, you can have empathy for them, but that doesn't mean that you have to fix it for them or that it's your responsibility, because guilt is usually like your actions don't meet your expectation of yourself. And
mm.
so a lot of times people can insert their expectation of you, and then you feel guilty because you didn't live up to their expectations. So I think that's important too, just assessing. My expectation was I would, take care of my well-being, and that's what I'm doing. So there's no reason to feel guilt, but I can feel empathy that hurt them.
Yeah, I love that. What's the difference between guilt and shame?
Shame is more I am bad, and guilt is I did something bad. So
I see.
shame is a lot trickier, I think.
Yeah, definitely seems like more of a deeper emotion feeling if that you could have.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
With both of those, the guilt, the shame, honestly, all of it, how do boundaries fall into place there? And are they something that's essential to feel those less?
Yes, I think that boundaries are important, especially with guilt and just kind of assessing the situation. Do I automatically feel guilty, or do I feel guilty after because they are guilt tripping me or they are shaming me? And so sometimes we need boundaries with other people to reduce how often they're shaming us and guilting us. And then sometimes we need boundaries with ourselves of what we want to share with somebody. So if it's somebody that, like, every time you share an accomplishment, they shame you and make you feel bad for it, then maybe your boundary with yourself is I just don't share XYZ with this person because it's not helpful for me. So, yeah, I think reducing the situations that bring that up is really important.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And I think honestly, boundaries are becoming something that is talked about a lot, but before boundaries were not talked about a lot. And so a lot of people are just learning, even in their adulthood, how to set a boundary and what a boundary even is. And I think that's so important and great for the younger generations that hopefully with this switch they're naturally able to understand what a boundary is and how to set one in place. If you were to give, let's say, 2 or 3 tips to set a healthy boundary with someone, what would those tips be?
So, I think establishing it like on your own, kind of identifying what is the behavior and what is the boundary I'm trying to set around it. Is it like they don't fill up my gas tank when they give me my car back, and that's the boundary that I want? And then, to before you set the boundary, make sure that you're ready to enforce it, especially if historically the person you're setting it with doesn't respect your boundaries. Just having the realistic expectation of I'm probably going to have to say it more than once, and if I say it more than 2 or 3 times, I might have to increase the boundary or create a boundary with myself around that. And then also being prepared to just endure the discomfort of that. Oftentimes, people aren't super happy with our boundaries. So just knowing that's okay, they're allowed to be hurt. But I can't set the boundary and caretake for the emotions at the same time. Like, I need to
Mm,
set the boundaries and then allow them to kind of process what that means for them, but I don't have to
yeah,
fix it for them.
I love that. I love that you brought up kind of dealing with the other person because that definitely can be, you've got the first part where it's being courageous and deciding that you're going to have this conversation and set this boundary. And then the second part, which is not, I don't want to use the word dealing, but hearing what the other person has to say and seeing how they react to it. And then from there, obviously, keeping the boundary in place, that sometimes feels very difficult, especially if you had a difficult person you're dealing with.
Yes, definitely. It can be hard. And yeah, I think like simple and direct language without over explaining is the best, especially with difficult people. You don't want to give a lot of reasoning because then they're just going to argue with you about your reasoning. So just saying, I expect this or I need this, and kind of leaving it there.
Yeah. going into relationships, I want to get your opinion on really the word and use of the word narcissism, because I have seen a lot of things. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I own a social media management agency. So I'm on social media all the time.
Mhm.
And I consume and I see a lot of people who are talking about or using the word narcissism loosely as a trait of someone that maybe treated them wrong or acted in a certain way. And I would love to hear from you, what is narcissism and what is it not? And who are we actually using that term for?
Yeah, so narcissism is a personality disorder, and it is with the intent to hurt other people. Typically, their behavior, they know what they're doing. And so, a lot of times that is overused now. And that's why I use the term emotionally immature, because even with personality disorder, some people can meet some criteria for narcissism, some for borderline, because in the DSM, there's like other specified personality disorders. And so, yeah, in terms of diagnosing, I just don't think it's super helpful. Like, I think it's good to focus on the behavior or how they treat you or how it impacts you versus trying to label them with a certain thing if you're not sure. And that's also why I use the term emotionally immature, because not all emotionally immature parents meet criteria for narcissism or borderline personality disorder. So, yeah.
I love the word or the term emotionally immature. I think that really is a better use for it. And that's something that you can work on, right? And that's something you can, if you feel that you are that, then you can work to become more mature in your emotional intelligence, correct?
Mhm. Yeah. And because also it's usually when we use those terms to, yeah, describe people, and then we use it to them, tell them that they're that, or tell them that they're emotionally immature, it's really not helpful. Like, we should be focusing on the behavior of due to this is my boundary or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. It's definitely more of an internal use if you're trying to discuss with maybe your therapist or yourself how that person is acting, but focusing on the actions is so important. And I think a lot of times within seeing a relationship, within talking and having those conversations, you can learn more about yourself and how you're viewing things, your emotional maturity, if you choose to kind of switch the mirror onto yourself versus always onto that other person.
Yes. Like, how is what they're doing impacting me?
Yeah, exactly. And then where is the work that I could be doing within that to react better or have clearer boundaries? At what point is the give and pull between, I think something I struggle with sometimes is like, I'm doing all this work and I try really hard to be able to communicate better or be able to listen better. And sometimes I feel like, okay, maybe I'm doing so much of this work. When is that realization, or what are things that you could look for if that person is just not willing to help you out on the other side and you're doing almost too much? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I think that is common within relationships with emotionally immature people. Every issue in their relationship is kind of framed as your fault. And so I think we just have to get to that in those types of relations, getting to a point where it clicks of I don't feel like I'm good enough for them, and I keep trying to get them to see that I'm not good enough, but maybe I can just accept I'm not good enough for them. Whatever they're looking for, I'm not that, and that's okay. And so then just having the boundaries or the separation when you're realizing that you're trying everything and they're not trying anything, I think is helpful, because they're like certain people are never going to say, there's like a saying that like everybody is in therapy for the people that won't go to therapy. So there's certain people, like narcissism is very low that they will go to therapy. And if they do that, they'll actually like be honest and start doing work, because everything is everybody else's fault. So I think it's just seeing people for who they show you that they are and believing that, instead of thinking like, well, if I'm just perfect, I'll get them to change and treat me well. You shouldn't have to convince somebody to treat you well. If they're not doing it, then they're probably not that willing.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, as someone who tends to be more on the empath side and someone who's a perfectionist, wants to do my best all the time. For me personally, I think it's easy for me to fall victim to that because I genuinely just want to show up and do a good job. And so I have to be I really got to wear my tight lenses and when I'm in these different relationships and going through these conversations, because I can easily, that's my automated response is just, okay, I'll fix it. I'll change. I know what I need to do. I need to be better and not really hold the other person responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's every two people have a cycle of interaction, it's usually not just on one person. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah. I think we've definitely become a society where we blame people and it's time to start taking some responsibility on both sides.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's definitely a lot of learning. But I would love to hear, this podcast is all about in between moments in our lives, which a lot of what you do is dealing with people who are in extreme in betweens. They're trying to maybe make a big life decision, or they just had something happen to them that was totally not what they planned for their life. What is advice that you give your clients when they're in an in between to get to the other side? Or maybe they're confused, they don't even know where they're supposed to go next, but they just know they're in that in between moment.
Well, in Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, she was talking about confusion and how when we're experiencing confusion, it's because we literally our brain doesn't have all the information we need to solve the thing. And so we need to let our brain integrate. And a lot of times that can just be taking a break for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or something like that. So that is something that I think is helpful, is if you are in between, just noticing that that is normal. Like, these parts of our life come up and it's just our brain and our body kind of needing to get new information about something. And then, yeah, so just like giving yourself grace and normalizing that always happens and it doesn't mean anything about you. And then I also really like the metaphor for winter and the trees, that they're bare, but inside of the branches, they are growing. You just can't see it yet. And so I think that's a good way to look at it as well. Like, you are growing. You might not see those things in front of you yet, but they're just still developing. They're marinating and they'll get
Yes.
there.
I love all of that. I love it. It's so true because there's so many things that you can't see and so many moments that have yet to happen. And so the in between can feel very defeating sometimes, especially if you're stuck in a moment where you're like, man, I just really did not think I was going to be here. But it's a matter of perspective always. And I think if you're able to shift your perspective into what's to come, it makes it a lot lighter and easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just normalizing it and then taking care of yourself, all of your basic needs, make sure those are still being met, even if you're feeling a little less motivated to do those things.
Absolutely. Well, Allison, I cannot thank you enough for joining me and chatting all the things. I appreciate you, and I've had so much fun talking about all this stuff because it's close to my heart, and so I hope that it reaches someone and provides education and just gets people asking questions if they've not heard about these modalities before, because they really are life changing. Would you be able to provide my audience a little bit with, your ideal clientele and who you serve, and then where they could reach out to you if they're interested in either following you on social media or even booking to discuss becoming your client?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I work with anxious teens and millennials, mostly, that grew up with emotionally immature parents and are experiencing low self-esteem, or they notice that they're people pleasing a lot in relationships. And I offer individual sessions and then also longer EMDR sessions for people in Nevada. And they can find me. My handle is Sit with Allison on Instagram. And then my website, which has my newsletter and my freebie and everything like that, is nightingalewellnesstherapy.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining on the In Between podcast. I appreciate you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.